If I shaped my activism around not wanting to offend anybody, I wouldn't be an activist. My activism is fundamentally offensive. It's pretty offensive to challenge people on habits they've been committing to for the past 30 years, 20 years, or their entire lives. It's fundamentally offensive. Hey, what is up, guys? So if you're on Instagram and you're familiar with James Aspey, you may have seen some of the drama that's been going on in relation to using the word Holocaust to describe what's happening to animals. If you're not familiar with the drama, long story short, James Aspey's been using the word Holocaust to describe what happens to animals. And there's been a lot of backlash from like intersectional vegans and vegans that just think that we shouldn't be doing this. So today I'm going to give my thoughts on whether or not we should be using the word Holocaust to describe what's happening to animals, and also just go through some of the arguments people are making against James Aspey and against using the word Holocaust to describe what happens to animals. So if you've been watching my channel for a bit, you know that I use the term Holocaust all the time, so I'm sure you can guess what my stance is on this issue. Now, before I go on, even though what I'm about to say has no actual bearing on the truth value of the points I plan to make in this video, I am a Jewish animal rights activist, so hopefully, for those who require somebody to be Jewish to speak on this topic, I will actually be listened to by you. So let's start with the many accusations I've seen James Aspey get, which is, if you use Holocaust to describe what happens to animals, you are being anti-Semitic. This to me is really just a non sequitur. Let's look at the definition of anti-Semitic. The definition reads, hostile to or prejudice against Jews. When we recognize that one of the definitions of the word Holocaust applies to what animals are going through, and with this knowledge, decide to categorize what animals are going through as a Holocaust, where is any degree of hostility or prejudice toward Jewish people? Jewish people aren't even being referred to in the use of the word Holocaust toward animals. As a Jewish person myself, I fail to see any evidence of anti-Semitism in referring to what animals go through as a Holocaust. Alright, so now let's cover this whole definitions controversy. Obviously, the word Holocaust has multiple definitions, and one of them clearly applies to what animals are going through. So from a definitions perspective, using this term makes total sense. Many will say that regardless of the fact that there is an applicable definition of what animals go through when it comes to the word Holocaust, either way, if you call what animals go through a Holocaust, you are minimizing the oppression that Jewish people and others faced during the Holocaust of World War II. Now, I'm unsure what this really means, but in response to it, I'm going to read a tweet that I made a couple days ago. You can refer to what animals go through as a Holocaust, no capital H, without taking away anything from the Holocaust. This isn't logically impossible, and to call what animals go through a Holocaust isn't to morally equate it to the Holocaust. It's to call what animals go through the correct thing, which is a Holocaust. You can recognize the animal Holocaust and the Holocaust without taking away from either. This isn't a competition, this is using the English language properly. The point is that the word Holocaust has multiple operational definitions. So for me to call what animals go through a Holocaust is just to describe what they're going through accurately. No claims or comparisons are being made about the Jewish Holocaust. We're just describing in a separate scenario what's happening with animals, which is that they're going through a Holocaust. I also would like to know how far this logic goes for people who operate under it. The word Holocaust was developed before the Holocaust of World War II. There are historical accounts of other groups of people being victims of genocide, which were called a Holocaust, before the Holocaust of World War II. Is there now a problem with referring to these incidences, which occurred before the Holocaust of World War II, as Holocaust? Are we now supposed to just partially erase the history of past Holocausts because the only incidents of mass killing in history that gets to be titled a Holocaust is the Holocaust of World War II? Does referring to past Holocausts as Holocaust take away from the victims of the Holocaust of World War II? If not, then I would have to ask, how does referring to what animals go through as a Holocaust take away from the victims of the World War II Holocaust, but doing the same thing for other groups of humans who were victims of mass killings way before the Holocaust of World War II? What is the moral difference here? I can't think of anything besides difference in species, which at the root would be speciesism. As a Jewish person myself, I think it would be pretty selfish of us to just get to reserve a word when many other past and current oppressed groups need it. I say need it because there is value in accurately describing what is happening to victims of oppression, human or not. A lot of people will say, then okay, sure, the definition does apply to animals, and saying the word doesn't necessarily take away from the victims of the Holocaust of World War II, but why can't you just use a different word anyway? Some people are offended. So here's the thing. If I were to change my language every time a person was offended by my words, I wouldn't even be an animal rights activist. I offend people just by merely talking about veganism. If I mention animals being murdered, I have somebody taking offense because they think that the term murder should only be applied to humans. If I speak against the use of animals, people will be offended because I'm being insensitive to specific cultures who practice using animals. I offend people on a daily basis with my social media content based on animal rights. I am unsure how this case is any different. The fact is that the term is applicable to animals. When I use the term, I'm not operating under some proprietary definition of the word Holocaust. I'm operating under a specific and objective definition. In the past, I've had people object to me using the word Holocaust. I show them the definition, and most of the time, they understand and relax. And after some time, the use of the word may even further convince them to think about what they are supporting. Of course, this doesn't always happen. Some people just get extremely emotional, and even within the face of objective facts, still disagree and are upset. This has happened to me, justifying the use of the word murder for animals. I show the person the definition of murder, which applies to animals, and the person just doesn't agree and remains offended. To these kinds of events, all I have to say is that sometimes you will be in the midst of people who are either unreasonable, being extremely emotional to the point where they're unreachable, or both. This just happens, especially when you're discussing an issue as controversial as animal rights. If I shaped my activism around not wanting to offend anybody, I wouldn't be an activist. My activism is fundamentally offensive. It's pretty offensive to challenge people on habits they've been committing to for the past 30 years, 20 years, or their entire lives. It's fundamentally offensive. I really just don't understand how somebody being offended can act as a justification for me to not be allowed to use the English language properly. Of course, outright insulting a person or being a dick and intending to harm another is completely different from using the English language properly and accurately describing the animal Holocaust as a Holocaust. To be clear, I just wanted to say that because I don't want you guys thinking that I think every account of using words is justified, but this account certainly is. The fact is that if the word Holocaust was developed after World War II and had strictly one operational definition, and that definition was to do with what happened in World War II, I would be on board with these vegan activists saying that we shouldn't be using the word Holocaust. But that just isn't the case. So should we be using the word Holocaust to describe what happens to animals? According to logic and the definition of words, yes. Just make sure you have the definition on deck in case you have somebody who's like, the Holocaust, I thought that was only to do with World War II. You say, oh, well, actually, what's happening to animals is actually properly defined as a Holocaust. Then you can show them what Holocaust means, and maybe they can reflect and say, hey, wow, I'm supporting a literal Holocaust every day for no good reason. Maybe I should stop. All right, guys, that is the end of the video. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Share this around to people who are against vegans using Holocaust to describe what's happening to animals, and maybe they'll change their mind or realize that, hey, it actually makes sense according to logic. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.
Dude, even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who's your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude, even vegans don't get your weird, stupid